Welcome to the worship service of Grace United Church in Wellsville, New York. We are so glad to have you participate with us in worship today. I have a question for you. When you read the news, have you noticed that often the religions of the world do not resemble their founders? Islam and Muhammad, Buddhism and Buddha, Christianity and Jesus. The dots don't always connect. New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof pointed out that Muhammad raised the status of women in his time, yet today some Islamic clerics bar women from being even just outside by themselves, unchaperoned. Buddha would probably be horrified by the racial segregation and the discrimination that Buddhists in Myanmar are imposing on the minority Muslims. And Jesus was a radical who challenged the establishment. But Christianity has been so strong that in many parts of the world, it has actually become the establishment. Sometimes it uses its strength to threaten and to harm people. Religions don't always resemble their founders. Writer and speaker Brian McLaren takes this even farther. He wrote a book called The Great Spiritual Migration. He says that world religions often stand for the very opposite of what their founders stood for. Why is this? The founders of religions are usually bold and charismatic visionaries. They inspire people with their fresh insights and their moral imaginations. But over time, their teachings are preserved by religions that are run by risk-averse bureaucracies. Instead of being bold and visionary, religions become obsessed with money and power. A video produced a few years ago called "Why I Hate Religion But Love Jesus" reflects this switch that people are noticing. Perhaps Christianity has become disconnected from Jesus. Many people are getting sick of the church. Recently, before a worship service in Iowa, the pastor read aloud a note that had been handed to him just a few moments prior to worship. He looked up from the note. He said, "It says here that I should announce that there will be no BS." He tucked the piece of paper in his pocket and added, "I'm hoping that they mean Bible study." People want a church that is true to Jesus, aligned with his ministry and his mission. So we have to ask ourselves, what would it mean for Christians to rediscover their faith? To rediscover the mission and ministry of Jesus? What would it mean for us to rediscover Christianity as a just and generous way of life, rooted in contemplation and expressed in compassion? For this to happen, McLaren says that we need to migrate. We need to move from one way of life to another. In particular, he challenged us to move from expressing our faith only as a system of beliefs to expressing it as a loving way of life. This is a migration away from religious bureaucracy and back to a vision of our founder, Jesus. It's a move away from pointing fingers to opening up our hands to relieve human suffering. It's a migration from endless church meetings to spending time making disciples. That is living like the first Christians did. That is what is described in the 2nd chapter of Acts. A just and generous way of life, rooted in contemplation and expressed in compassion. That's the kind of religion that Jesus founded. And it's the answer to the question, what church would Jesus belong to today? In Acts chapter 1, Jesus tells his followers, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Then he disappears. His words become true according to the account in Acts 2 when the Holy Spirit comes upon them. Acts tells us that all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Immediately, the followers of Jesus become witnesses. They begin to speak about God's deeds of power in languages that are clear to the international crowd that is gathered there in Jerusalem. Then the Apostle Peter begins to speak about the life and death of Jesus, giving testimony to how God raised him up, having freed him from death, because it was impossible for him to be held in its power. His words resulted in the baptism of 3,000 people in one day alone. But the power of the Christian message was communicated not only by words, but by deeds. Acts tells us that the members of the church devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. They shared everything. In fact, they would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any person had need of them. Because of this just and generous way of life, rooted in prayer and expressed in compassion, the church had the goodwill of all the people that surrounded them. It continued to grow day by day as the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Clearly, this is the kind of religion that resembles its founder. It is precisely the kind of church that Jesus would want to belong to, one defined by a loving way of life. So what does such a way of life look like? First, it is a life that is not attached to material things. A pastor was met by a church member at the door after worship. The pastor commented on the great tie that the man was wearing, and the man smiled and thanked him. And immediately, right then and there at the door, he took off his tie and he gave it to the pastor. Everyone seemed shocked and a little embarrassed by such a radical act of public generosity. Jesus wants us to be part of a church that is generous and one that is not attached to material things. A church of this kind existed in Jerusalem, where the members there would sell their possessions and their goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any of them had need. What do you think would be a modern-day example of this kind of church? Probably these kind of churches would put mission instead of church maintenance. They would give generously to programs that feed the hungry and for programs that shelter the homeless. They would fund programs that welcome strangers and rescue vulnerable children and visit people in prison. They're not reluctant to practice extravagant generosity. Remember the man that received the tie from his parishioner? After a while, he was talking to his associate pastor about this extravagant generosity that this parishioner had showed to him. And the associate was impressed by the gift, but he couldn't resist asking this pastor a question. He said, "Gee, why didn't you compliment the man on the car that he was driving?" Second, a loving way of life is one that is open and receptive to others. Jesus is a model of receptivity, and he challenges us to be open to the needs of others. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus gets out of a boat and immediately receives a request from a leader of the synagogue to come and to heal his daughter. As Jesus is going to her, he is interrupted by a woman with a bleeding problem. But instead of being annoyed, Jesus attends to her and then finally makes it to the leader's house, only to find that this little girl is dead. But Jesus is not discouraged. He tells the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And then he raises the little girl from the dead. Jesus shows us that the power of God is seen clearly in a life of openness and receptivity to the needs of others. In Jerusalem, awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. They cared for the people around them, and as a result, they had the goodwill of all of the people that lived there. Third, a loving way of life is marked by spiritual maturity. In the Jerusalem church, the members devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. They made sure that they were nourished by teaching and preaching, by communion and by prayer. Spiritual feeding was needed before the church members could go out and feed the hungry around them. Acts tells us that as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and they ate their food with glad and generous hearts. Their worship and fellowship strengthen them as the followers of Christ, changing their behavior and making them more interested in the fruits of the Spirit than in the works of the flesh. Jesus wants to be a part of a community that is spiritually mature, one that is rooted in prayer and in contemplation. The fruits of such a community are acts of compassion and generosity. This kind of life is described by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to Timothy. He challenges his fellow Christians to do good, to be rich in good works, generous and ready to share. The result, says Paul, is the life that really is a life. Jesus wants us to enjoy this kind of life, one that is marked by a lack of attachment to material things, one that is marked by an openness and a receptivity to others, and one that is marked by spiritual maturity. He wants us to build a community of justice and generosity, one that is rooted in contemplation and committed to acts of compassion. Have you ever wondered whether Jesus is a person that we would really like to have as a member of our congregation? Would we really want Jesus sitting on any of the church ministry teams or on the church board? The Gospels seem to suggest that Jesus wasn't the easiest person in the world to get along with. He criticized how people prayed. He was critical of certain traditions. He often called people hypocrites. Once he got violent in something like the church foyer. He indulged in occasional name-calling, and during the week he was often seen with the unpopular people, those on the fringes of society that other people don't like to hang around with. And he seemed to love picking fun and irritating the establishment. People here at Grace United have thought about some of the challenges that we face trying to be welcoming and trying to be Christ-like. This past week I came across the Church Covenant. It's a remarkable document that was created several years ago when the Christian Temple joined together with First Congregational Church. This covenant talks about our partnership with God, our partnership with each other, and with the world. In it are instructions about how we are to live together, our attitudes and our actions in relationship to God and to one another, and how we should relate to the world. It encourages us to pray. It tells us about how we're to talk with one another when we have disagreements, and about inviting the stranger in our midst. One phrase in particular caught my attention. It says, "Our goal will not be uniformity of belief, but shared purpose. That purpose being to declare God as a reality among people." Our purpose is to declare God as a reality among people. We have agreed together to declare God, to speak about God, to do things in God's name. We acknowledge God in our own lives and speak of God's goodness to each other and to those who we know. You know, people do a lot of declaring these days. The news is filled with voices of people declaring things. Bumper stickers abound on vehicles, and banners in yards declare people's allegiance to sports teams or political causes. How easily we can talk about these things. But remember, as a church, we promise to declare God. How are we doing at that? How are we using our voices to declare God? How are our actions declaring God in our lives? To declare God as a reality. We believe that God is real. At Grace United, we acknowledge God as alive and moving in our lives. We are not involved in church because it's a nice social gathering. We come because we believe in a living God who knows us and cares about us. We come to worship to thank God and to reorient ourselves to spiritual things each week. God is a reality in heaven and on earth. And so we declare God as a reality among people. God is working among people. Acts 17 says that in God we live and move and have our being. We are in God, and God is among us, in our midst, in the midst of people, listening and prodding, moving, working for the good. Jesus came to earth in bodily form to walk alongside us in a very physical way to declare God's moving as we work alongside others. We partner with God, with others and the world. This is the kind of church that Jesus wants to build. Jesus wants us to build a community of justice and generosity, one that is rooted in contemplation and committed to acts of compassion. When we do these things, our church and the Christian church as a whole won't be hated by the world. Instead, it will receive the goodwill of all the people. What people are inspired by is not bureaucracy or doctrine or ancient rituals or even by the most glorious church buildings or cathedrals. Rather, we're inspired, as Nicholas Kristof concludes, we're inspired by a Catholic missionary doctor in Sudan treating bomb victims, or an evangelical physician achieving the impossible in rural Angola. He says, they fill me with an almost holy sense of awe. Now that's religion. A church that is moved by the things that move God's heart. That's a church that Jesus would be proud to join. Let us be such a church. God bless you.